Welcome to Our View, the podcast, where we're changing the conversation about disability one story at a time. Here at Our View, we're all about education, awareness, and shifting perspectives. With each episode, we dive into honest, meaningful conversations with individuals from across the disabled community, amplifying voices, sharing lived experiences, and challenging the way society sees disability. Because disability isn't a limitation, it's a part of the human experience. So pull up a seat and join us as we broaden the view and bring real, powerful stories into focus. This is Our View. This episode of Our View, the podcast, is brought to you by All In for Inclusive Education. All In for Inclusive Education is a New Jersey-based nonprofit organization that supports inclusive education for all students with disabilities as a fundamental civil right. All In for Inclusive Education views inclusion as a means to creating an equitable, socially just, democratic society. All In's vision is of a society where all individuals are valued members of their community and have opportunities to reach their maximum potential. For more information about All In, follow them on social media on Facebook at All In for Inclusive Education and on Instagram at All In for Inclusive Ed. Also, be sure to visit their website, www.allinforinclusiveed.org. I would like to welcome everyone back to a new episode of Our View, the podcast. I'm your host, Arthur Aston, and today on the podcast, I am happy to welcome my guest, Dr. Jeff Kontio. So thank you for joining me today for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Yes. So, as I mentioned in in the introduction to this podcast episode, this episode is brought to you by All In for Inclusive Education. And today, our conversation with you is all about your presentation that you had recently at the Winter Conference for All In for Inclusive Education. So, before we get into your presentation, I would just like for you to introduce yourself to everyone, and you can share as much of your story, what you do for a profession, some of your hobbies. And also, can you share with us what is your definition of inclusive education?
Sure. My name is Jeffrey Kontio, or Jeff Kontio, like you mentioned. I go by Jeff or Jeffrey. Neither one's right or wrong. On the professional side of my life, I wear quite a few different hats. I am the IT manager for the Department of Politics down at Princeton University. I am also an adjunct instructor at Rutgers University, where I teach a course on web accessibility, focusing on making sure that our students are outgoing students are better prepared to create more accessible content for themselves or for the organization they're working for, so that the content is available for the widest possible audience, getting them, a better understanding of those accessibility concepts and why they're so important. On the fun side of my life, I am a volunteer puppy raiser for the Seeing Eye out of Morristown, New Jersey. It is the oldest guide dog school in the world, again, based here in New Jersey. And yeah, it's a really good organization. I've loved working with them, and it's really helped get me another view of the importance of accessibility and the work of service that we do. Um, a lot of the stuff that I do focus on work, on supporting education and supporting inclusive environments, just in general. So that work with the Seeing Eye really helps build that foundation for me, and it really is a core of what I do and what I feel is why I feel what I do is so important. Yeah, and like to your question of my view on like what inclusive education means to me, it's interesting. I was listening to an interview legitimately last night, a podcast interview, where one of the people on this panel that were this circular table that we're all chatting, was talking about um kind of paraphrased this idea that it was mainly focusing on sports, but that sport is a willing acceptance of arbitrary or let's see if I can get this right. That sport is a willing acceptance of arbitrary constraints, I think is how he worded it. And that line kind of really struck with me for some reason. It was one of those things that kind of pinged the back of my ear, and I was like, let me think about this more. Um, because I think that really kind of feeds nicely into this idea of what inclusive education is really trying to do. The video was really talking about inclusion and equity based on the lens of the Paralympics. And they were saying something to the effect of, if you want to see what inclusion can look like in practice, look at how the Paralympics approaches competition. If one athlete's missing, let's say, their right leg below the knee and the other one's missing the left leg at the knee, how can we, as organizers, design a competition so that it's fair? How you structure the environment uh, in that competition to measure athletic performance rather than simply, you know, just based on like, how we see them, right? The difference of limb differences or the likes. And again, it kind of really like plucked just the right chord for me. And kind of really drove that thought to me. That idea of inclusion and a wider audience for me. Because it really does make me think like, are we measuring the thing that we actually want students to learn, or are we creating these unintentional, or even arbitrary constraints around it for the purpose of like, well, it's just how it's been, right? This is how I was taught. This is how we've always approached it. I remember my middle school a math class sitting down, and I had to complete my times tables before I could move on to the next section of the class, where all my classmates were already past that. I was still sitting there, and I had to finish my times tables before and the time constraint that I was required to finish it in. And there was, I mean, I still can't finish that in the time constraints. And finally, they're like, you know what, you're close enough. We'll move you on. And like, really, so this really does feed into my own academic journey. But ultimately, when we design learning in that very constrictive way, we start moving we're pushing students away from the enjoyment of learning and the enjoyment of having those aha moments. And so shifting that mindset to more inclusive and barrier removing process, we can ultimately design learning the way we need to and removing those barriers and helping people learn what they need to learn and the way that they learn it so that they can carry that process on in the future.
I love what you said, the enjoyment of learning. Like it should be, it should be fun. Learning should be fun. And to make it more enjoyable and more inclusive so that everybody learns differently. I also was, when you brought up the math, the timetables and things, it was like that was my struggle in school too. Math is not my thing.
Sorry for bringing up the PTSD.
Yeah.
It was, we're struggling together in that one.
Yes. Math was not my subject, still isn't.
Same.
But the ways of, and it wasn't until college, I brought this up in previous episodes of the podcast, it wasn't until college where I realized my teacher the person that stands at the front of the room, the educator, really wasn't always, the best at helping me. It was from my peers that I learned how to do
Yeah.
things a lot better.
Yeah,
Uh,
and it was very similar for me. Like, and it was unfortunately for me, it was one of those things where like even sitting in undergrad college, I struggled
mhm.
through a lot of that too. And I started off as a music major because I loved music. I played saxophone for years. I was like, I'm gonna be a music ed teacher. I'm gonna teach K-12 or K-12 music. I'm gonna love it. It's great. Then when we got into things like music theory and the likes, like my brain just couldn't wrap my head around like all these like very finite theory items. Like, okay, I can play it, but like
Right.
I can't write it. But that's not how my brain works.
Hmm.
And what it turned into me was like, okay, well, maybe music isn't for me. Maybe the passion that I have isn't the passion that I have. Maybe it's just like this fleeting thing, and maybe I should look elsewhere. So, I mean, by no means am I saying that I regret not following that path because I'm very proud and happy where I am now. But going back and looking at it, I was like, that idea of like, had my instructors found a better way to get me through that process and understanding those higher level theories of music, where what would have been, how would my life have changed? Would I be happier? Again, not trying to like relive the past and redelegate that,
Right.
but it's just one of those things that like, you know, I look at pictures from my freshman year of college and how much I loved playing, and I miss that part of me, if I'm honest. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's like I said, just hearing you talk and it's it really brought back, I won't say bad memories, just brought back memories.
Yeah, yeah,
And making learning enjoyable for everyone is really a great way to put it. And the analogy that you used from the podcast you were listening to about the Paralympics, and because they're going on currently right now, and
yeah,
so it's a very timely analogy to make. So thank you for bringing that up. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, so as I mentioned in the beginning, you recently presented, we're recording this in March. So back in January, you were a presenter at the All In for Inclusive Education Winter Inclusion Conference. And your presentation was titled What You Do Matters, Overcoming Barriers and Bridging Gaps with Inclusive Design for Learning. So my next it's a two-part question. So can you share a brief summary of what your session was about? And also, can you identify some of the barriers that educators might face when teaching?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the overall idea and concept of my session that I had was talking about those little steps we make and those little things we do in our day to day as we're designing our course content or as we're working with our whether you're working in K-12 or higher ed, your different learning type, the way your students like bring in that content and digest it better. So it really focused on this idea that I'm leaning on of that's inclusive design for learning. It brings the ideas of universal design for learning, which feeds in from universal design, and inclusive educational practices through a lens of the social model for disability, which forgive me if I'm oversimplifying if I'm oversimplifying this idea, but it's this concept of that barriers that are out there for anybody who may have a disability is societally designed, not adherent to who they are. So it is the society that needs to fix the barrier, not the person that needs to be fixed, is the general idea that I approach the social model through. Um, yeah, so I often say that when I introduce this type of work is that we probably don't need another acronym or framework because there's plenty of them out there, right? But that said, this one kind of helps us take all these little things and find a way to bridge them together, both these concepts and the way we design our learning for our students. You know, learning doesn't really just take place in one space. Students are constantly moving between classrooms, digital platforms, your learning management system, whatever that might be, and, your institutional systems, whether it's from, elementary to middle school to high school to different classrooms, if you swap classrooms out from different hours, different segments through your day. And, in reality, those environments are deeply interconnected, especially the digital and physical world. A lot of times when we talk about accessibility, it's those combinations that I try to bring in. Um, and that realization of like those connections and the design choices that we make to shape those spaces kind of helped design this idea in my head of like, okay, now let's take these ideas, let's shine a light on those bridges so that we can make sure that the barrier that we're not creating these unintentional barriers based on you know unnecessary expectations of students that aren't needed. Um, some of the barriers that I think educators face when doing this type of work, especially creating a more inclusive learning environment, is the learning environments themselves, whether it be your online learning environment, your Google Classroom, your Canvas, depending on how large of an institution you have and how large of a budget you have to buy something. These can be, in the classroom, physical classroom, providing paper handouts for all students and just expecting them to be able to read through them, versus having a digital version. I've talked to colleges and talked to faculty about them sharing their slide decks out to students either before or after the lectures, and instructors saying, I love doing that. I love, that's something that I'm very proud of doing, but my attendance has dropped. So I feel like I'm negatively affecting those students to positively affect these students. And I said, and I approach it. I'm like, okay, that's a fair assessment, and I'm with you on that one. But let's think about what we're doing here. If those students don't need to be in your lecture to gain knowledge of the content and can still succeed in your assessments and still succeed in the projects you might provide them, they're still learning the content. They're learning it their way. Just because they're not sitting in your classroom doesn't mean they're not getting their money out of it. the money that they're getting out of it is the knowledge at the end of the class. And if they have gone through this and you provide those slide decks, you've done all this work, and they're still not getting the content and they're not getting their money's worth, well, you've provided the classroom for them, you've provided all the content for them, you've provided them your time, they're not taking advantage of it. So the second barrier, I think, is the idea that um, by opening up and making more inclusive environment, we are concerned that we are negatively affecting students because they're ignoring the things that they need to learn. We can try and provide them the supports, we can reach out to them, but at the end of the day, especially when we're in my role in higher ed, they're adults and they have to deal with the repercussions of their choices. So that's kind of my answer to that second barrier. And the third one is often an institutional barrier in that they're pushback from administrators, or if you're an instructional coach, pushback from the faculty that are teachers that you're coaching, and trying to make those moves, trying to push that barrier out of the way. And a talk that I'm giving next week for Rutgers University's online learning conference. I'm talking about one of the examples of bringing up is the snowstorms we got here in Jersey over the last couple months. And whenever you're doing, if your car got stuck in the snow, if you're parked in the street and you're stuck, that first push to get out of the snowbank or out of the snow is always hard. But once you get moving, once the traction hits and you make that push and you stay consistent, suddenly it gets easier and easier and easier, and then the car's going down the road. And that is my answer to that third barrier of the institutional pushback. Is that yes, you're going to have some pushback, you're going to have some feedback, you're going to have some people that are clutching what they want to do and how they do it. But consistency and non-aggressive consistency. Not saying that anybody would be aggressive with this, but doing it in a way that is showing that why, like really building out that foundational why of what we're doing, will help make that push out of that snowbank a little easier once you get that traction. So those are the three main barriers that I often see for educators.
Again, another great analogy, the snow. Thankfully,
I'm
all.
originally from I'm originally from Michigan, so I lived 10 months out of the
Oh,
year of snow. So it's
oh.
very much so part of my culture. So
And this was like the most snow we had in New Jersey in a long time. So it seemed like it was never
mhm.
going away. But, we're
Yeah,
recording this on March 10th and it's 70 something degrees
I was
now.
gonna
So
say the spring is peeking out of the corners here.
it's coming. So thank you for that summary and for identifying some of those barriers. And at this point in our conversation, I would like to take a brief break to share with our listeners more about All In for Inclusive Education. This episode of Our View the Podcast is brought to you by All In for Inclusive Education. All In for Inclusive Education is hosting their summer All In conference taking place on May 28th, 2026 at Kean University in Union, New Jersey. Please visit www.allinforinclusiveed.org for more information. Registration is available until May 14th, 2026, so register today. So we are back to continue our conversation with Dr. Jeff Kontio. So thank you for joining me. I'm enjoying our conversation so far. And just two more questions before we wrap up today. So the next question is, can you share with us one or two takeaways that the attendees would have learned from your presentation?
Yeah. So one of the big takeaways that I hope they gained from my presentation, I try to hit home pretty regularly, is that um, the small design choices that we've made matter. Whether it is, trying to find multi-modal ways to provide the content to your students, so not just a handout, but also a recorded version of it in a podcast like this, or using tools available to you, like something like, I don't know if your school might have access to something like Google's Notebook LM, which creates a podcast tool, which is going through its own legal things, but hopefully it still comes through because it's a great tool to help create that conversation with students. They can upload document you share, and then they can have conversations with chatbot or have a podcast provided to them that kind of go over to kind of great tools. I love these tools. Um, Inclusive learning environments really come to fruition one small step at a time. They rarely are built through one big change. They're built through many small intentional choices that focus on the clarity and flexibility and how the information is presented. And some of the research that I did for my dissertation, focusing on how we create how we create and how we promote the creation of these more accessible content for our especially our digital coursework, focusing on small things and focusing on starting off with saying, this is something that we're really promoting and really like think feels very important. Um, and like and advertising it as that very important first step. And then moving in the future into more of a hardline step once you pass what I've coined, or I think I've coined, I haven't found anybody else that has coined something similar of like this institutional commitment threshold of like, okay, we have now made it past this part of this curve where like it's getting easier. So let's lock it in at that point so we don't fall back into what was easier before, which yeah, so that was one of the big things. Like small design choices have a big impact to create a more uh, easier to participate, full learning environment for our students. And the other one is one that I sometimes get pushback on, but it's one that I feel is also important to think about, is that a lot of the barriers that our students are going to face are often predictable. It's things that we are not really that we're not really paying attention to. And as soon as we shine a light on it, we are better able to see it. And I see that in my own life, my own work, and in my own teachings of students, and when we talk about web accessibility. Um, and I always hear it in my feedback, and through the semester, I hear it too, is that once students start looking at how things are designed through an accessible lens, they see more accessibility and even some lack of accessibility in their own world outside of that digital environment. So once we open that door just a little bit and start talking about it and start learning more about it, we see barriers more easily. Um, and that kind of um, and the barriers that we see are often repeated again and again. And it's that repetition that tells us something important about how we do our design. Are we just copy and pasting and just, saying, what, this worked before, we're going to do it again? Or are we looking back and saying, okay, we did this and we had these barriers. Can we fix them? Here's how we can fix them. And version 2.0 has those fixes. And let's move on from here until we're ready for 3.0, because there's going to be some changes we're going to need to make again. And as a side note to take away, that would be that accessibility is a constant process. You're never going to be 100% of the way there, because frankly, being somebody who works in IT, technology is not going to stop for you.
All great takeaways, and I love the first one about the small changes, the small steps. It's and the last one, like you said, it's just it's a constant process. It's ongoing, and it just that's really really great. So thank you for
Yeah.
sharing those takeaways from your session. So the last question I have for you today is, can you offer some useful resources? They can be books, websites, videos, or anything related to the topics of inclusive design for learning that our listeners can explore on their own after listening to this episode.
Yeah, so I think the two big things that I kind of fall back on a lot is well, three things technically. One of them is obviously CAST's Universal Design for Learning framework. It's a fantastic tool. They've revamped it somewhat recently to kind of be the next layer, next level of more universal design for our learning environments. And that's just working through that and seeing what tools from there fit within your teaching style, your institution, your classroom, whatever title or whatever seat you want to sit yourself in. um, and their website also has some really good practical guidelines and examples for educators that they can apply bits and pieces right away. Like there's little things you can do. And frankly, the half one, I'll do one and a half. The half one to that universal design for learning is some accessibility training that I went through to work towards a accessibility certificate through the International Association. Look at my tag here, International Association for Accessibility Professionals. They have some great resources out there as well, including some certifications that you can get to kind of show an extra layer of an extra an extra badge for yourself to say I'm an accessible person and I know more about accessibility and here's a proof that I have that. That's been a great resource for me, and it also forced me to continue to go through what they call continuing education, right? Because you have to maintain a lot of these certifications. So it keeps me on track with staying up and knowledgeable what's happening by requiring me to have some more workshops and whatnot after the fact. So that's a kind of like a side step to that CAS universal design because it's through that certification that I learned about universal design. The second big one I would say is this mainly focuses on the digital side of it, but it is a fantastic tool and it's a fantastic set of guidelines for you. And it is the Web Accessibility Initiative through the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C. Their Web Accessibility Initiative is fantastic. It highlights strategies, standards and supporting resources that really make, a lot of your digital content more accessible. One that I teach on from them is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that even if you're not building websites, going through those and kind of getting an idea of what they're trying to do in that will absolutely help you redesign or either redesign your current digital content, be it your documents or your websites or your digital classrooms, but then also take those things you've adjusted and adapted and changed and continue making better content going forward. So the Web Accessibility Initiative from the W3C is a fantastic tool to really help make your digital content more accessible. So those are really my two big resources that I rely on a lot, and kind of fall back on a lot as well. Additionally, you mentioned All In. A lot of their resources are fantastic. I was privileged enough to also get a chance to work with them on a project outside of this conference to create trainings for paraprofessionals for inclusive educational practices, which I think is a fantastic, if I may say so myself, a fantastic set of training modules for that as well. There's a lot of great tools out there, but I think mainly starting out with CAST and W3C are kind of a really good foundational starting points.
Great. Thank you so much for those resources. And I can definitely agree with you. Working with the team there at All In has been such fun for me. I enjoy all of them there, and and I appreciate them for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. And thank you for joining me for this conversation and sharing the summary of your session from the inclusion conference that was held over the winter, and look forward to seeing you at a future conference and hopefully
Yeah.
having more conversations like this with you
Thank
sometimes.
you. It was great talking with you.
Yes, you too. Thank you. This episode of Our View the Podcast is brought to you by All In for Inclusive Education. All In for Inclusive Education is a New Jersey-based nonprofit organization that supports inclusive education for all students with disabilities as a fundamental civil right. All In for Inclusive Education views inclusion as a means to creating an equitable, socially just, democratic society. All In's vision is of a society where all individuals are valued members of their community and have opportunities to reach their maximum potential. For more information about All In, follow them on social media on Facebook at All In for Inclusive Education and on Instagram at All In for Inclusive Ed. Also, be sure to visit their website, www.allinforinclusiveed.org. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Our View, the podcast, where we amplify the voices and stories of those in the disabled community one conversation at a time. If this story moved you, taught you something new, or sparked a different perspective, we'd love to hear from you. Write a review of the podcast on Apple Podcast and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Follow us on all social media platforms at Our View for Life 25. At Our View, we believe that disability is not a limitation, it is a powerful part of the human experience. So until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep seeing the world through our view.